He was always the first one through the door in the morning and the last one to turn off the lights at night. Not because anyone asked him to, not because there was a bonus waiting or a promotion dangling at the end of the tunnel, but simply because the stillness of an empty building was easier to bear than the stillness of his apartment. Ryan Carter moved through the hallways of Harrison Industries the way a shadow moves through a room. Present, functional, noticed only when someone needed something fixed. A loose hinge, a flickering fluorescent tube, a jammed freight elevator that corporate kept forgetting to put on the maintenance schedule. He fixed things. That was what he did. That was, most days, the entirety of what he allowed himself to be. And the world around him, the office gossip, the Friday drinks, the dating app horror stories traded over the coffee machine, moved like weather through a window he had long since stopped bothering to open. He was 38 years old that autumn, though most of his colleagues would have guessed older, not because he looked worn down, but because there was a particular quality to his silence, the kind that doesn't come from shyness or social anxiety, but from a man who has already lived through the loudest, most devastating chapter of his life, and chosen, deliberately, to keep the volume low from that point forward. He worked in building maintenance for a mid-sized corporate group that most people in the city had heard of. His tools were clean, his work was methodical, and he ate lunch alone at a corner table by the loading dock, reading second-hand paperbacks with broken spines. His colleagues had a nickname for him, not a cruel one, exactly, more of a bemused office shorthand. They called him the Invisible Man, not because he was strange, but because for all the time he spent in the building, he somehow managed to avoid becoming part of it. No birthday drinks, no holiday party small talk, no mention, ever, of a girlfriend or a date or even a passing interest in anyone. He was a ghost who paid his union dues and showed up on time. And most people had simply stopped wondering why. Most people, but not everyone. Emily Harrison was 29 years into her life and 4 years into the role of Chief Executive Officer of Harrison Industries, a company her father had built from a regional supply firm into a mid-market corporate group with offices in 6 cities. She had taken the helm young, had navigated the skepticism of a board full of men twice her age, and had done it with a kind of controlled precision that earned respect even from those who had initially doubted her. She was sharp and direct and did not waste time performing warmth she did not feel. But she was also, beneath the polished exterior, genuinely observant, a quality her MBA program had tried to frame as strategic intelligence, but which was really just something she had been born with. She noticed people, she noticed patterns, and she had noticed, over the months since she had taken a more active role in managing the company's day-to-day operations, that the maintenance worker who passed her office window every Tuesday and Thursday morning was the only employee she had never once seen smile. Not a sad face, not an unfriendly one. Just the face of someone who had packed all his expressions away somewhere private and forgotten, for long stretches, to retrieve them. She found herself wondering, not quite consciously at first, what that was about. What it took. What kind of life produced a man like that? The company's annual anniversary party was held in the 3rd week of October, in the main atrium of the flagship office building. The decorating committee had gone all out, rented string lights, a catered spread with 2 kinds of salmon, a bartender mixing cocktails with the company logo stenciled in foam on top. Nearly everyone came, which was the point. It was one of those events that functioned as much as a social obligation as a celebration, the kind where attendance was technically optional, but professionally inadvisable. Ryan came because the maintenance team was responsible for post-event cleanup, and his supervisor had strongly implied that presence before the cleanup was expected. He positioned himself near the edge of the room, with a glass of sparkling water, watching the evening move the way he always watched things quietly, a little apart, taking it in without participating. The atrium was bright and noisy. Clusters of people laughed at stories he couldn't hear. Someone from sales had brought a ukulele and was performing an inexplicably confident rendition of a song from the 1990s. The bartender was doing brisk business. Around the 2-hour mark, when the party had found its natural loose rhythm, a group of colleagues near the center of the room fell into that particular kind of conversation that forms when enough people have had 2 drinks and the subject of relationships is nearby. Someone mentioned they had matched with 3 people on an app in 1 week. Someone else groaned about a bad first date. A woman from accounts receivable announced, to general laughter, that she had sworn off dating anyone who used the word journey unironically. It was warm, easy, the kind of social current that flows through company parties without ever meaning anything serious. And then Marcus, one of the junior facilities guys who worked alongside Ryan, spotted him at the edge of the room and called over with a grin on his face and a beer in his hand. "Carter, get over here. We're talking about your love life." There was a ripple of laughter. Ryan didn't move. He smiled faintly, the way he always smiled at things like this, acknowledging the joke without feeding it. But Marcus kept going, the way people do when a crowd is laughing. "Seriously, man, you've got to get back out there. It's been, what, forever?" More laughter, warmer this time. Someone said something about apps being easy now. Someone else said he just needed to try. And then Emily Harrison, who had been standing at the edge of the same conversation with a glass of red wine and the particular alertness of someone who has trained herself never to look bored at company events, turned and looked at Ryan directly. She had been half listening, half watching him from across the circle, the way she sometimes did, cataloging him, almost the way you might study something that doesn't quite fit the pattern of everything else around it. And something about the moment, the laughter, the easy social pressure, the way Marcus had lobbed the question like a soft pitch, expecting Ryan to bat it away with the usual deflection, made her ask her own version of the question, not mockingly, not performatively, but with genuine, unguarded curiosity. She said it clearly enough for the people nearby to hear. "Honestly, Ryan, why don't you date?" The laughter in the circle rippled again, expecting the same deflection. People turned to watch. And Ryan, who had been looking at the middle distance with the calm face he always wore, lowered his eyes to the glass of water in his hand. He didn't look flustered. He didn't look annoyed. He just went still for a moment, the kind of stillness that has weight to it, and then he looked up and said it quietly, and without drama, the way a person states a fact they have long since made their peace with. He said, "Because I made a promise to someone that I wouldn't love anyone else." The laughter stopped. The atrium, in that small circle, went quiet. Emily thought about those words for 3 days. She turned them over on her commute, in the margins of meetings, at the edge of sleep. Not obsessively, she was not the type for obsession, but with the persistent, low hum of something that doesn't resolve on its own. She told herself it was curiosity, professional and detached. She told herself she was simply trying to understand a member of her staff. Both things were partially true, and neither was the whole story. She began, carefully, to look into Ryan Carter's background. Not in any invasive way, she pulled his employee file, looked at his listed work history, asked Marcus in passing what he knew. What emerged was a portrait that surprised her. Ryan had attended a well-regarded engineering school on a partial scholarship. His academic record showed a student who worked hard and finished near the top of his class. He had gone on to a position at a technology firm that no longer existed, worked there for 3 years in product development, and then around a decade ago disappeared entirely from that industry. No transition story. No LinkedIn trail leading somewhere else. He had simply walked out of one life and into another one. From a trajectory that pointed upward into one that pointed nowhere in particular. He had been at Harrison Industries for 7 years, starting in an entry-level maintenance role and advancing to his current position through reliable performance rather than ambition. She mentioned this to a colleague she trusted, framing it as a general HR observation that it was unusual to have someone with that kind of educational background in a maintenance role. Her colleague shrugged and said some people just fall through the cracks. Emily knew that wasn't it. People with engineering degrees from good schools didn't simply fall through cracks into building maintenance. They got redirected. Something pushed them off one path and they found another, and whatever the something was, it was usually either catastrophic or deeply personal or both. She kept thinking about the photograph. She hadn't exactly found it. Marcus had shown it to her, casually, one afternoon when they had been discussing the upcoming facilities budget, pulling out his phone to show her a photo from a team outing years ago. Ryan was in the background, barely visible, talking to a woman with dark hair who was laughing so completely that her whole body seemed involved in it. She looked joyful in the irreversible way of people who don't know yet that joy is fragile. Ryan, in the photograph, was smiling in a way Emily had never seen him smile in the years since. It was the smile of someone who had not yet learned to keep that part of himself locked away. It was Marcus who eventually told her the story, not maliciously, not as gossip, but in the way people share things about friends when someone else is clearly trying to understand. He told her over coffee one afternoon, quietly, the way the most important things are usually told. Her name was Sarah. Sarah Cole. Though she had been going to be Sarah Carter before the end came. She and Ryan had met in their sophomore year of college at a study group that neither of them particularly wanted to attend, and the story, as Marcus told it, was one of those that seem almost implausibly complete, even from the outside, two people who fit each other in the particular and irreplaceable way that makes everyone around them quietly relieved to see love working the way it's supposed to. They had the same humor, the same specific brand of stubbornness, the same habit of reading aloud passages from whatever they were reading to whoever was nearby. They had graduated together, moved to the same city, both started careers, and somewhere in the middle of everything else, Ryan had proposed at a hiking trail on a Tuesday in November, in the rain, because they had always said they'd do it someday, and Tuesday seemed as good as any. Sarah had said yes with mud on her boots, and laughed about it for months afterward. They had planned a small wedding. Nothing elaborate, a courthouse ceremony with 30 people. Dinner at a restaurant where the tables were too close together and the candles dripped onto the checkered tablecloths and nobody minded. They had talked about a house eventually, maybe a dog first, kids after. They were building the architecture of a future that felt solid and unhurried, and theirs. Ryan had been promoted twice. Sarah was moving up at her own firm. Everything was in the process of becoming what they had imagined, which is exactly when things are most fragile, though nobody ever knows that until later. The diagnosis came in the spring of the year they were supposed to get married. A routine appointment. A doctor who frowned at something on a scan and said words that rearranged the world into a different configuration. The disease was advanced not because Sarah had been careless, but because it was the kind that moves silently and announces itself only when silence is no longer available. The timeline the doctors offered was not a timeline anyone wanted. Ryan did not treat it as a timeline. He treated it as a problem to be solved, which is how engineers treat everything, and for a period of months, he operated at a frequency of pure, channeled action that the people around him would later describe as both inspiring and terrifying. He sold his car. He liquidated his savings. He negotiated with every specialist he could find. He researched clinical trials in other cities and flew to consultations that cost more than he could afford, and came home with binders full of information and a face that gave nothing away because giving things away would have made them real. He resigned from the engineering firm, not because he had to, exactly, but because being at work meant being away from Sarah. And being away from Sarah was something he was no longer able to justify. The career trajectory he had been on simply ceased to be relevant. He did not grieve it. He set it down the way you set down something you're carrying when someone more important needs your hands. People told him things during that period. Friends told him to pace himself, that he couldn't help her if he ran himself into the ground. His own family told him, gently at first and then with more urgency, that he should think about his future, that he was young, that he had his whole life ahead of him, that Sarah would understand if he needed to step back and protect himself. Some of them said it with kindness, and some of them said it with the thin anxiety of people who find devotion they can't relate to vaguely unsettling. Ryan heard all of it. He understood where it came from. He did not change course by a single degree, because here was the thing that most people understood logically, but could not quite feel all the way down. Sarah was not a chapter in Ryan's life. She was not a relationship or a relationship status or a period of time that could be closed and learned from and moved past. She was the person around whom his entire sense of what life was supposed to feel like had been organized. Losing her was not going to be a loss. It was going to be a restructuring of reality itself, and no amount of advanced preparation was going to soften that. So he did not waste a single day on preparation. He spent every day with her instead. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in March, about 6 weeks before the end. The hospital room had a window that faced west, and the light at that hour came in golden and long and made everything look kinder than it was. Sarah had been having a better day, not a good day, not the way good days used to work, but a clearer one, a more present one, and she had been talking more than she had in weeks, and Ryan had been sitting beside her holding her hand and talking back, which was something they had always been good at. She said she wanted to talk about him. He said she didn't have to. She said she did. She had been thinking, she told him, about what came after. Not her after she had made a kind of peace with that. Or as much peace as a 31-year-old can make with the end of everything. She meant his after. She wanted to talk about what his life was going to look like and whether he was going to be okay in the particular way that okay means more than functional. He told her not to worry about him. She told him that was not a reasonable request. They had a version of this conversation 3 times in different forms before she got to the center of what she needed to say. She was afraid, she told him, that he was going to stop living. Not in the literal sense, she knew he would get up every morning and keep going. Because that was what Ryan Carter did. That was the engine at the core of him, but in the sense of actually living, of being present in his own life. Of allowing himself the full range of what a person is allowed to feel. She was afraid he would build a monument out of her memory, and then move into it, and never come out. He started to say that wasn't going to happen, and she stopped him. She said, "I need you to promise me something." And Ryan, whose instinct was always to protect her, said, "Anything." And then she asked him to be happy, to be, eventually, open, to not close himself off from love because of her. He was quiet for a long time. He said he didn't know if he could promise that. She said she wasn't asking him to promise a feeling. She was asking him to promise to remain open to one. That was different. That was a thing a person could choose. The argument went on for a long time. The way arguments go when both people are right about different parts of the same thing. At some point, when the light from the window had gone, and the room was lit only by the soft institutional glow of the overhead fixture, she asked him the question that would stay with him for the next decade. "If I'm not here anymore, will you forget me?" And Ryan, without hesitation, said, "Never." And Sarah cried. He kept the promise he had made, the one about never forgetting her. He kept it completely and without effort. Because it did not require effort. What he had not fully understood, in that hospital room on that Tuesday in March, was that by holding on to that promise with both hands for 10 years, he had quietly, without intending to, let the other promise go. Not forgotten it. Not rejected it, but deferred it indefinitely, in the way that deferrals become defaults, and defaults become the shape of a life. Emily heard all of this over 2 separate conversations, one with Marcus, one with a woman named Janet, who had worked at Harrison Industries for 20 years, and had known Ryan from his first week. She sat with the information carefully, the way she sat with anything that required her to revise an assumption. She had assumed, before, that Ryan was closed off because he was cold. She understood now that he was closed off because he had loved someone completely and lost her, and had since been operating on a kind of internal maintenance schedule, keeping everything running, keeping everything functional, not asking the machinery to do anything it hadn't been asked to do since Sarah died. She did not find this pathetic. She found it, in a way she had not expected, extraordinary. She had grown up around ambitious people, people who treated feelings as variables to be optimized. People who would have said, sincerely and without cruelty, that a decade was too long to grieve, and that at some point a person had to move on. Ryan had never moved on. He had also never fully lived, which was not the same thing as moving on, and was arguably its own kind of failure, though not the kind that comes from weakness, the kind that comes from having loved something so large that every subsequent space feels too small. She found herself thinking about him differently after that. She began noticing the things she had always registered, but never processed the way he handled the younger guys on the maintenance team, with a kind of undemonstrative patience that was rarer than most people realized. The way he spoke, on the rare occasions he did speak at length, with a quiet precision that didn't match a man whose career had stalled and ambition had faded. The way he looked at the building he maintained not with resentment or resignation, but with the matter-of-fact engagement of someone who had chosen this and was not interested in being reassured about the choice. She found herself engineering reasons to be in the same space as him, which was something she would have recognized as ridiculous in anyone else, and found only mildly embarrassing in herself. She stopped by the loading dock once, under the pretext of inspecting a facilities concern. She asked him once about the maintenance schedule for the third floor. Standing in the hallway outside her office, and talking for 20 minutes about nothing that required 20 minutes. Ryan was polite. He was helpful. He maintained, with complete composure, exactly the 2-foot radius of professional distance that he maintained with everyone. And she came away from each of these encounters feeling, slightly absurdly, that she had pressed against a wall and found it solid. She was sitting in her office late on a Thursday afternoon when it occurred to her, the thought arriving with the casual certainty of something that has been true for a while and is only now willing to be acknowledged, that she was drawn to him, not to the sadness of his story, not to the romance of a man who had loved and lost, but to him specifically, to his stillness, to his competence, to the sense she had that underneath the maintenance uniform and the polished professional distance, there was a person she had not yet had the chance to know, and was increasingly frustrated not to. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was not a feeling that came with obvious next steps. She filed it away and got back to work, and then she kept finding it again. She invited him to dinner on a Friday in November, framing it as a professional courtesy, a thank you for his role in managing a particularly complicated renovation that had kept the third floor operational during what should have been a significant disruption. It was plausible enough as pretexts went. He accepted with the polite, neutral acceptance of an employee who has been invited to dinner by his CEO and doesn't want to read anything into it. The restaurant she chose was quiet, not trendy, not a place designed to impress. Just a neighborhood Italian with good lighting and tables that were far enough apart for a real conversation. Ryan arrived exactly on time in a dark jacket she suspected he had bought for occasions like this, and worn perhaps 3 times. They talked about the renovation first, because that was the stated reason for the dinner. And then they talked about other things, and the conversation moved with a naturalness that Emily had not entirely expected, not smoothly, not without the occasional friction of 2 people navigating different comfort levels, but honestly, the way conversations go when both people stop performing. At some point, somewhere in the second hour, Emily set her fork down and asked him something she had been thinking about for weeks. She said, "If Sarah wanted you to be happy, and Marcus told me enough for me to know she did, don't you think that living the way you've been living is a way of not keeping your promise to her?" She said it gently, not as an accusation, but in the way she said hard things at work directly, with respect, because she thought he was a person who could handle directness, and because she meant it as a thing worth considering rather than a judgment. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, and then he reached into the inside pocket of the dark jacket and set something down between them, a letter, folded and refolded many times. The paper softened along the creases with the handling of years. He said that Sarah had written it in the last weeks. He had never shown it to anyone. He was not sure, even as he offered it, exactly why he was offering it now. He just said, "Here," and slid it across the table. Emily unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was small and precise, slightly unsteady in places. The handwriting of someone writing through fatigue or pain and refusing to let it show too much. She read it in silence. The letter was not long. It took Emily less than 3 minutes to read it, but she read it twice. And by the second time, her eyes were blurred enough that some of the words ran together. Sarah had written it the way she had apparently lived, with directness and without self-pity, and with a grace that Emily found almost unbearable to hold in her hands. She thanked Ryan for everything. which took several lines, each one specific. Not the general thank you of a card, but the particular card and airy too, an accumulated thank you of a woman cataloging the texture of a love she was grateful to have had. She wrote that she was not afraid of what was coming. She wrote that she had been afraid, early on, and that Ryan had talked her through the fear in the specific way he talked her through everything, which was by being present rather than by saying the right words, and that it had worked, and she was grateful. She wrote that she had one remaining fear, not death, not the mechanics of it, but the particular version of the future in which Ryan stopped living because she had stopped. She wrote that she did not want to be the reason he became smaller. She used that word deliberately, smaller, and Emily could feel the weight of it in the context of everything she had learned. Sarah had known Ryan well enough to name the exact shape his grief would take. She had seen it coming, and she had written this letter as a preemptive argument against it, and she had trusted him to do the right thing with it eventually. She wrote, "Near the end, I want you to fall in love again someday. Not because you've forgotten me, I know you won't, and I don't want you to, but because loving is the part of you I loved most, and I don't want that part to go to waste." She closed the letter simply. She said she loved him. She said goodbye in a way that felt, even filtered through a stranger's eyes and a decade of distance, like a door closing gently rather than slamming shut. Emily set the letter down. She did not try to stop the tears, they were already on her face before she registered them, the way grief sometimes moves faster than awareness. She understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, the precise nature of what Ryan had been carrying for 10 years. He had kept the promise he made in response to her question, the promise not to forget, and in doing so had quietly, incrementally, failed to keep the promise her letter asked of him, not out of stubbornness, not out of a refusal to move forward, but because the first promise had been easy, and the second one had been impossible. And he had not yet found the place inside himself where impossible became something he was willing to attempt. Ryan sat across the table from her and watched her read, and something happened in him during those minutes that he would have struggled to articulate. He had not planned to show her the letter. He had not planned to show anyone the letter. Ever it was private in a way that felt absolute, the last private thing, the most private thing. But something about the question she had asked had opened a door he had kept shut for a long time. Not forced it, she hadn't forced anything, hadn't pushed or prodded in the way people sometimes did when they sensed a story, but asked it with enough directness and enough genuine intent that he had felt, for the first time in years, that the answer deserved more space than he usually gave it. He watched Emily's face as she read. He watched the tears arrive. He did not look away. There was something in him that had grown very still, not the trained stillness of avoidance, but something quieter and more unfamiliar, something that felt, at its edges, like the beginning of being seen. It was not a comfortable sensation. It was not uncomfortable either. It was like a window he had forgotten was there, being opened from the inside. He did not say much when she finished reading. She handed the letter back. He folded it the way he always folded it, along the old creases, and put it back in his pocket. They sat for a while without speaking, which was not an awkward silence but a necessary one, the kind that forms after something true has been said or shown, when the air needs a moment to redistribute itself. Eventually he said, "She was better than I deserved." Emily said, "She sounds like she was exactly what you deserved." He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who is examining a statement they are not sure they are allowed to accept. Then he looked at the table. Then he said he should probably get the check. They walked out into the November air and said goodnight with the slightly formal courtesy of two people who have been more honest with each other than they expected and are not quite sure what to do with that yet. He went to the cemetery on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later. He had been going every month since she died, not out of ritual obligation, not because he felt she was there in some literal way, but because it was the one place where he could talk out loud about things without feeling like he owed anyone an explanation. The cemetery was small and old and tree-lined, the kind that feels more like a park than a destination for grief, which was one of the reasons he had chosen it. He brought nothing special, no flowers, no objects. He sat down on the bench near the stone, and he talked, the way he always talked, in the unhurried conversational style of someone who has long since gotten past needing responses. He talked about the usual things, first the building, a problem they'd had with the HVAC on the 4th floor, a book he'd been reading, and then he stopped and sat for a while and said what he had actually come to say. He told her about Emily. He said it plainly that there was a woman, that she was his boss, that she had asked him about his life in a way he hadn't been asked before, that she had read the letter, and that she had cried in a way that told him she understood and that he had felt something. He did not dramatize the feeling. He just named it and let it sit in the air. He told Sarah that he had been thinking about the letter for weeks, not for the first time, but differently this time, in a way that felt less like reading a document and more like finally hearing what was being said. He said, "I think I've been keeping the wrong promise." His voice did not break. He was past the point where his voice broke when he talked about her, which was not the same as being past the grief, just past the point where the grief surprised him. He said he was sorry for taking so long to understand. He said he thought she would have liked Emily the directness, the lack of sentimentality, the way she said hard things without apology. He sat for another hour after that, not talking, just present, the way he had always been present with her, and then he stood up and drove home. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. There was no sudden transformation, no scene of Ryan arriving at the office with a new bearing and a new wardrobe and a lightness in his step that announced to everyone that something had shifted. What changed was smaller and more interior than that, though people who knew him well would later say, in retrospect, that they had noticed something, a slight easing, a willingness to stay a few minutes longer at the coffee machine, a smile that appeared a beat sooner than it used to. He ran into Emily in the elevator twice, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with facilities management, which had not happened before. He returned her texts about work-related matters with slightly more than the minimum required response. Small things, the kind of things that are easy to explain away as nothing, and that collectively add up to something. He was, in the language of engineering, recalibrating, making small measured adjustments rather than a wholesale redesign, feeling out the new tolerances of a system he had let run at minimum capacity for a decade. In the second week of December, at a company event for a charitable campaign that Emily had organized, Ryan appeared without being required to appear. He walked in wearing the dark jacket, found Emily across the room, and crossed to where she was standing with the kind of deliberate calm of someone who has thought through what he is about to do and decided to do it anyway. He said her name. She turned. The room was busy around them, voices, the clink of glasses, the low sound of a string quartet that someone had hired and then placed inexplicably near the restrooms. He said, in the same quiet, unhurried tone he used for everything, "I've been thinking about what you asked me at dinner. I think I've been keeping the wrong version of a promise for a long time. I'm not sure I know how to stop doing that overnight. But I was wondering if you might want to have dinner again sometime." Not as a professional courtesy, Emily looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a sentence to finish and is not quite ready for it to be over. Then she said, "Yes." And then she said, "I was starting to think you were going to make me ask again." And he almost laughed. It was not a full laugh. It was the beginning of one, visible in the slight loosening of his face, the way a window admits the first light of a morning that isn't quite there yet. There was no dramatic ending to the story of Ryan Carter and the decade he spent living inside a promise. There was no proposal at a scenic overlook, no movie music moment where the past was officially laid to rest and the future was formally declared open for business. Real life, the kind where people love and lose and slowly, imperfectly, find their way back towards something worth holding on to, doesn't move in those arcs. What there was instead was quieter and more lasting. There was a man who had been standing still for 10 years, taking a first, slow step forward, not because the grief had ended, but because he had finally understood that grief and living were not mutually exclusive and never had been. There was a woman who had been curious about a ghost and found, instead, a person specific and complicated and worth knowing. There were two people, both carrying their histories, both old enough to understand that hope is not a naive thing but an act of will, sitting across tables from each other and learning the particular vocabulary of each other's silences. That was what the story was, in the end. Not a transformation. A continuation. Ryan still went to the cemetery. He still kept the letter in his jacket pocket. He had not stopped loving Sarah. Would not stop. Would never be asked to. What he had stopped doing was confusing love with preservation, confusing the keeping of a memory with the refusal to move. The thing he had promised. In that hospital room, with the golden light coming through the window, was to remember. He had not been asked to stop. He had not been asked to diminish, to replace, to cover over. He had only been asked, in the last letter he would ever receive from the woman he loved, to keep the part of himself that was capable of love alive. To not let it go to waste. It had taken him 10 years, and a dinner, and a CEO, with a talent for asking the wrong questions at exactly the right moment, to understand what that actually meant. But he had gotten there. Imperfectly, slowly, with the methodical persistence of a maintenance worker who believes that most broken things can be repaired if you're willing to spend the time. He had gotten there. There is a particular kind of love that people don't talk about enough, not the kind that begins, not the kind that ends, but the kind that persists and transforms and teaches you something about yourself only after it's had years to do its work. The kind that takes a person who was becoming one thing and makes them, through its loss, into someone else entirely, and then waits, patient and quiet, for that someone else to figure out what they're supposed to do next. Ryan Carter had been shaped by love that enormous. He had been, for a decade, partially defined by its loss, and he was beginning, for the first time, to be defined by what came after, which is not the erasure of everything that came before, but the place where everything that came before is finally allowed to rest. The greatest loves are not the ones we carry forever unchanged. They are the ones that change us enough to love again. The ones that ask us, even as they end, to remain open, to stay soft in the places that were hurt, to resist the temptation of numbness, to trust that the heart, which has already proven it can hold something extraordinary, is capable of holding something new. Sarah had known that about Ryan before he did. She had written it in a letter, and folded it, and trusted him to read it when he was ready. He had been ready, in the end, on a Thursday night in November, in a restaurant with tables too close together and candles that dripped wax. Sometimes the most important things arrive in ordinary rooms. Sometimes the people who change our lives are waiting quietly at the edges of rooms we've been moving through for years. Sometimes love doesn't announce itself. It just waits. And the bravest thing a person can do, after loss, is not to stop feeling the loss, but to accept that the loss itself is proof of something worth having had, and to let that proof be enough to begin again. He had not told Marcus about the dinner. He had not told anyone, but Marcus noticed the way people who have worked alongside someone for years notice things that are too small to name, but too real to ignore. That Ryan was different in December than he had been in October. Not loudly different. Not in any way that invited comment or required explanation. Just different, in the way a house is different. When someone has opened a window in a room that had been closed for a long time, the air moves. Something in the quality of the light changes. You cannot point to exactly what it is, and yet you know something has shifted. Marcus said nothing. He watched, and he understood. And he kept his understanding to himself, the way a good friend keeps the things that are not his to tell. Emily, for her part, did not tell anyone, either not because she was ashamed or uncertain, but because she had spent enough years as a CEO to know that some things need to live privately for a while before they can survive being known publicly. What was between her and Ryan was new and tender, and not yet ready for the particular exposure of other people's opinions. She protected it the way she protected things that mattered, carefully, without drawing attention to the protection itself. She found herself doing things she hadn't done in years. She left the office at a reasonable hour twice in 1 week. She cooked dinner at home on a Sunday evening. Something she had not done since moving into a new apartment, 18 months prior, and telling herself she'd get around to it. She called her mother, who had been asking her for 2 years whether she was meeting anyone, and said something that wasn't quite an answer, but also wasn't the non-answer her mother had grown accustomed to receiving. Ryan took her to dinner the second time, at a place he had chosen himself, a small restaurant near the waterfront that he had been to once, years ago, with Sarah, and had not been back to since. He was not sure, driving there, why he had chosen it. Perhaps because going back was a way of completing something, of walking into a room from his previous life, and discovering that he could breathe in it. Perhaps because the food was genuinely good, and he had not been back simply out of the kind of inertia that governs most decisions made under prolonged grief, and it seemed like time. He didn't tell Emily the history of the choice. He just took her there, and they sat by the window, and he ordered the same pasta he had ordered the only other time he had been there. And he was still himself when they left, which was what he had needed to know. They talked, that second dinner, about things that had nothing to do with Sarah, or loss, or the decade Ryan had spent in something like suspension. They talked about her childhood, about growing up in the specific, complicated shadow of a successful father, about learning to want things for herself rather than for the approval they generated. They talked about his engineering degree and the things he had been interested in before life had redirected him so completely. He said, mildly, that he sometimes still thought about the problems he used to work on thermal systems, load distribution, the elegant logic of structures designed to bear weight. She said that sounded like a different kind of maintenance than what he did now. He considered this. He said he supposed it was all the same idea, understanding what something is built to hold, and making sure it isn't asked to carry more than that. She thought about this for longer than the conversation required. She thought it might be the most accurate description of what he had been doing for 10 years that she had heard. There were hard conversations, too, not that night, but in the weeks and months that followed, as the thing between them grew from tentative and fragile into something more resilient. Ryan had moments where the grief rose up in him unexpectedly. In the way grief does, even after years, not as a wave that overwhelmed, but as a kind of ambient weight that settled over an otherwise ordinary day. He learned to say so, not elaborately, not with explanations that sought reassurance, but in the matter-of-fact way he said most things. Today is a heavy day, and this is why. Emily learned to hear it without trying to fix it, which was harder for her than she expected, because she was, at her core, someone who fixed things, but she learned. The learning itself was a kind of love, the unglamorous kind. The kind that looks like a small daily act of paying attention and requires no witness. Ryan kept going to the cemetery. He kept going monthly, and then less frequently, but with the same intention not to maintain a vigil. Not because he had not moved, but because the visits had become something other than grief. They had become a kind of conversation with the version of himself that had been shaped by Sarah, a check-in with the person he was before and the person he was becoming, a way of carrying the past that didn't require him to live in it. He brought flowers sometimes, and sometimes nothing. He talked when he had things to say, and sat quietly when he didn't. He stopped apologizing, over the course of many visits, for being happy. Happiness, it turned out, was not a betrayal. It was the instruction he had been given, folded in the inside pocket of a jacket, in a letter he had carried for 10 years, waiting until he was ready to follow it. The letter stayed in the jacket. He suspected it always would. What Ryan Carter learned, in the second decade of his adult life, was not a lesson that lends itself to easy statement. It was not about letting go or moving on. The phrases that people reach for when they are trying to describe recovery from grief and find that the available language is inadequate. He had not let go. He had not moved on. What he had done was subtler and stranger, and more true to the actual texture of being a person who loves someone. He had expanded. He had made more room not by evicting what was already there, but by discovering that the interior of a human life is larger than it feels when you have spent 10 years standing in one corner of it. There was space for the past and space for the present. There was space for Sarah and space for Emily. Not as competing claims or sequential chapters, but as different rooms in the same house. Each with its own light, each real. He was not a different man than the one who had sat by a hospital bed in the fading afternoon and promised to remember. He was the same man, living larger, finally, fully, and in the only way that the woman he had first loved had ever asked him to live. Some promises are about holding on. Others, looked at long enough, turn out to be about letting yourself be held.